August 9, 1944. Dawn over the Bay of Biscay will fire for 7 hours. The Liberator groaned through the salt-thick air, engines droning in their mechanical chorus as the young gunner settled into the cramped turret. 19 years old, 6 weeks out of gunnery, school, first operational mission. His name was written in fresh ink on the crew roster, one among thousands of young Americans ferried across the Atlantic to rain fire on a continent already burning. The aircraft shook with turbulence as it descended through patchy fog, nosing toward the French coast where German U-boats sheltered in concrete pens that swallowed bombs like pebbles into stone. His hands, still smooth and uncalloused by war, gripped the twin .50 caliber handles. The intercom crackled. Target ahead. Flak incoming. His heart hammered against ribs that had never known real fear until this moment. Then it happened. Not according to doctrine, not according to training, not according to the careful, methodical instructions shouted over engine noise in Oklahoma classrooms. What happened next would later be studied, analyzed, refined, and eventually codified into official tactical manuals used across every theater of the war. But in that moment, in that freezing turret with adrenaline screaming through veins and instinct overriding instruction, he simply reacted, and in reacting, he stumbled into a tactical innovation that would save thousands of lives and reshape the mechanics of aerial combat for the remainder of World War II and beyond. The modification was not a machine, not a design, not a strategic revelation delivered by generals in quiet rooms. It was a mistake born of panic, inexperience, and a particular chaos that only combat can produce. Yet within weeks, that mistake would become doctrine. Within months, it would spread across bomber groups from England to Italy to the Pacific. And within a year, German and Japanese fighter pilots would curse the name of a tactic they could not counter. Born from the split-second terror of a teenager who had never fired his guns in anger. Before that morning dot, by the summer of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had matured into a relentless industrial process. Thousands of bombers flying fortresses, Liberators, Lancasters crossed the Channel daily, striking targets deep within Axis territory. Oil refineries burned, rail yards shattered, factories crumbled. The campaign was methodical, overwhelming, and staggeringly costly. Bomber crews flew in formations designed for mutual defense, each aircraft positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Gunners trained to hold discipline, to wait for enemy fighters to close within effective range before opening fire. Ammunition was finite. Accuracy mattered. Doctrine emphasized controlled, coordinated burst time to maximize lethality while conserving rounds for prolonged engagements. But doctrine assumed calm. It assumed rational calculation under pressure. It assumed that young men, fresh from training and facing death for the first time, would remember their instructions when every instinct screamed at them to do something, anything, to survive. And for most, doctrine held. Training overrode panic. Fire discipline was maintained. Bomber formations defended themselves with practiced precision. Gunners tracking targets, squeezing triggers in measured bursts, conserving ammunition for the long hours over enemy territory until the moment when it didn't. The young gunner's B-4 was part of a raid targeting U-boat pens at Lorient, massive concrete fortifications on the French Atlantic coast that housed the submarines strangling Allied supply lines. These pens were nearly indestructible roofs reinforced with meters of steel and concrete that shrugged off even direct hits from heavy bombs. The raids continued anyway, not because they destroyed the pens, but because they disrupted operations, forced repairs, and kept pressure on German naval infrastructure. The missions were dangerous. Flak batteries ringed the installations. Luftwaffe fighters launched from nearby airfields, exploiting gaps in escort coverage to slash into bomber formations with coordinated attacks. The B-24 shuddered as flak bursts erupted around it, black flowers of shrapnel blooming in the pale morning sky. The formation tightened. Bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft steadied for the run. Then, from above and to starboard, the FW-190s came, four of them, diving fast, wings glinting as they rolled into attack position. The intercom exploded with shouts. Gunners swiveled turrets, tracking the attackers. The young gunner, fingers slick with sweat inside his gloves, followed the lead fighter with his sight. It grew larger, closer. The moment approached when doctrine said to fire when the enemy entered effective range, and a controlled burst had the best chance of hitting. But something broke inside him. Not courage, not discipline, something more primal. Terror, raw and absolute, flooded his mind. The fighter was too close, too fast, too real. Training evaporated. Doctrine vanished. He squeezed the triggers and did not let go. The twin .50 calibers roared. Tracers streamed out in a continuous, blazing ribbon, not short bursts, not controlled fire, a sustained, desperate torrent of lead that poured into the sky like water from a broken dam. He held the triggers down, feeling the turret shake with recoil. Watching the ammunition belt feed through the guns in a blur, the stream of fire reached out, farther than he thought possible, stitching across to where the FW-190 would be, filling the approach corridor with a wall of metal dot, and the FW-190 flew directly into it. The fighter disintegrated. One moment it was a sleek, deadly machine, engine howling as it closed for the kill. The next, it was fragments, wing sections spinning away, fuselage erupting in flame, pilot's canopy shattering as the aircraft came apart, under the sustained hammering of .50 caliber rounds that never stopped, never paused, never gave the pilot a gap to exploit. The wreckage tumbled past the formation, trailing smoke and fire. The young gunner released the triggers, hands trembling. His guns were nearly empty. He had violated every principle of fire discipline. He had wasted ammunition. He had panicked. He had also just discovered something no one had fully understood before. The revelation was not immediate. In the chaos of combat, individual actions blur into the larger battle. The B-24 completed its run, dropped its bombs, and turned for home. The young gunner reloaded, his mind replaying the moment, the sustained fire, the fighter's destruction, the sheer overwhelming violence of continuous barrage. He expected reprimand. He had burned through ammunition at a reckless rate. But when the aircraft landed and the crew debriefed, something unexpected happened. Other crews reported similar incidents. Gunners who, in the heat of combat, had abandoned short-burst doctrine and unleashed sustained fire. Some had done so deliberately, frustrated by missed shots and the difficulty of timing bursts against fast-moving targets. Others, like the young gunner, had simply panicked and held the triggers down, but the results were consistent. Enemy fighters caught in sustained fire were devastated, not merely damaged or driven off, but destroyed outright. The continuous stream of tracers created a visible, terrifying barrier that enemy pilots struggled to penetrate, and those who tried often did not survive. Intelligence officers began compiling reports. Gunnery instructors reviewed combat footage. Patterns emerged. The traditional doctrine of short, controlled bursts was based on ground target engagements and peacetime training assumptions. It conserved ammunition and maintained weapon reliability, but it also created gaps, brief moments between bursts, when enemy fighters could jink, roll, or accelerate through the defensive fire. Skilled pilots exploited these gaps ruthlessly, timing their attacks to slip between volleys. Sustained fire eliminated the gaps. It turned defensive gunnery from a series of discrete shots into a continuous stream, a river of metal that enemy aircraft had to cross. The psychological effect was profound. Pilots facing short bursts could calculate risks, exploit timing, and press attacks with confidence. Pilots facing sustained fire saw an unbroken wall of tracers and hesitated. Hesitation in aerial combat was often fatal, not because it led to being shot down, but because it caused pilots to break off attacks prematurely, reducing their effectiveness and giving bombers critical seconds to escape. The tactical implications were staggering. Bomber formations, already formidable in their defensive firepower, became exponentially more dangerous when gunners switched to sustained fire. The volume of bullets in the air increased. The visible deterrent effect intensified. Enemy fighters found it harder to close within lethal range. Attack runs became riskier. Losses mounted. Luftwaffe and Japanese pilots, accustomed to calculated aggression, found themselves forced into defensive postures by the sheer, relentless volume of fire pouring from bomber formations. But sustained fire introduced problems. Ammunition consumption skyrocketed. Guns overheated faster. Barrel wear increased. Logistics chains, already strained by the demands of global war, faced new pressures. Bomber groups needed more ammunition per sortie. Armories worked overtime producing belts, maintenance. Crews inspected gun barrels more frequently, replacing worn components to prevent failures. The shift from doctrine to practice required adjustments across the entire operational system. Yet the results justified the costs. Bomber loss rates declined in groups that adopted sustained fire tactics. Crews reported fewer successful enemy attacks. Gunners, emboldened by the visible effectiveness of continuous fire, engaged more aggressively and with greater confidence. Morale improved. The psychological burden of bomber duty flying into flak at fighters with only defensive guns for protection eased slightly as crews realized they had a weapon that worked consistently and visibly against the enemy. The young gunner, meanwhile, flew more missions. His initial panic gave way to deliberate practice. He learned to modulate sustained fire, not endless streams that emptied guns in seconds, but controlled continuous bursts that maintained pressure while conserving ammunition. He studied enemy fighter tactics, anticipating approach angles and prepositioning his fire to intercept. He became, over the course of 20 missions, an effective gunner, not through natural talent or exceptional training, but through the brutal education of combat and the willingness to learn from his own mistakes. His squadron mates began adopting the technique. Gunnery officers, initially skeptical, observed the results and quietly encouraged experimentation. Official doctrine lagged behind practice, as it often did in war. Manuals still emphasized short bursts. Training films still showed controlled fire, but in the operational theaters, where survival mattered more than procedure, sustained fire spread organically. Crews talked, techniques were shared. The innovation that began with one terrified teenager's mistake became the standard practice of thousands. By late 1944, training programs in the United States began incorporating sustained fire techniques. Gunnery schools adjusted curricula. Instructors, many of whom were combat veterans returned for training duty, emphasized the importance of continuous pressure over discrete accuracy. Ammunition loads per aircraft increased. Gun cooling systems were improved. The logistical and technical infrastructure adapted to support the new reality of aerial gunnery. For German and Japanese fighter pilots, the shift was devastating. Tactical approaches that had worked for years slashing attacks time between defensive bursts, coordinated runs exploiting gaps in coverage became suicidal. Pilots found themselves flying into unbroken streams of fire that gave no quarter and no opportunity. Loss rates among fighter units increased. Experienced pilots, already scarce after years of attrition, became irreplaceable casualties. Replacements, rushed through training and thrown into combat, lacked the skill to survive even brief engagements against bombers defended by sustained fire. Intelligence reports from captured enemy pilots reflected the impact. Interrogators noted repeated references to the continuous fire or unending tracers encountered over targets. Some pilots described it as a wall, others as a river. All agreed it was terrifying and nearly impossible to penetrate. The psychological toll was measurable. Enemy pilots hesitated longer before committing to attacks. Break-off distances increased. Engagement times shortened. The effectiveness of Axis interceptors declined not because the aircraft were inferior, but because their pilots could not press home attacks against the volume of fire they now faced. The innovation also highlighted a broader truth about combat. That doctrine, no matter how carefully constructed, could not anticipate every variable. War was chaos. Training provided foundations, but real effectiveness emerged from adaptation. The young gunner's panic had accidentally revealed a tactical gap, a flaw in defensive doctrine that prioritized ammunition conservation over psychological dominance. His mistake, replicated and refined by thousands of others, corrected that flaw. This was not unique to gunnery. Throughout the war, countless tactical innovations emerged from frontline experience rather than staff planning. Skip bombing, born from a pilot's improvisation over the Pacific. Hedgerow-busting bulldozer tanks, welded together by engineers in Normandy fields. Close air support techniques developed by pilots and ground troops coordinating under fire. Each innovation followed the same pattern. Someone encountered a problem, tried something unconventional, and discovered it worked. The institution, initially resistant, eventually recognized effectiveness and standardized the practice. The American military, more than most, facilitated this process. Its culture emphasized initiative, pragmatism, and results over rigid adherence to doctrine. Frontline personnel were encouraged to report problems and suggest solutions. Innovations that proved effective were documented, tested, and disseminated rapidly. The system was not perfect. Bureaucracy still slowed adoption, and many good ideas languished, but it was responsive enough to incorporate lessons learned in combat and translate them into operational improvements. This stood in contrast to Axis militaries, where hierarchy and doctrinal rigidity often stifled innovation. German tactical flexibility was exceptional at the small unit level, but strategic and technological adaptation was slow and hampered by competing authorities. Japanese military culture prized discipline and adherence to established methods, making deviation from doctrine risky even when circumstances demanded it. Both faced enemies who learned faster, adapted quicker, and institutionalized improvements more effectively. The sustained fire tactic exemplified this difference. Within months of its discovery, it was being taught to new gunners, incorporated into operational plans and supported by logistical adjustments. By war's end, it was simply how aerial gunnery was done, so thoroughly integrated into practice that its origins as an accidental panic response were largely forgotten. The young gunner survived the war, 30 missions over Europe, then rotation home to a country that barely understood what he had endured. He returned to a life that felt alien in small jobs, routines, the mundane concerns of a nation at peace. The war receded into memory, vivid and sharp in his mind, but incommunicable to those who had not been there. He rarely spoke of it. The terror, the noise, the cold, the moments when death came so close he could smell burning metal and see the faces of enemy pilots. Through their canopies, all of it stayed locked inside, shared only with other veterans in quiet moments when words were unnecessary. He never claimed credit for the tactic. He did not seek recognition or write memoirs detailing his contribution. To him, it had not been innovation, it had been panic. The fact that others had learned from it, that it had saved lives and altered tactics, was incidental. He had simply done what he had to do to survive. That thousands of others had benefited was a consequence, not a goal, but historians would later identify his actions, cross-reference with after-action reports and gunnery school records, as the likely origin point of sustained fire doctrine. His panic had been documented, his results had been observed, his technique had been replicated. The chain of causation was traceable, if not definitive. He was, in the language of military history, the probable originator of a combat innovation that changed the war. And he lived the rest of his life not knowing it mattered. The broader lesson of sustained fire extended beyond tactics. It illustrated the relationship between fear and innovation. The young gunner's panic had not been weakness, it had been a response to overwhelming threat that bypassed conscious thought and accessed deeper survival instincts. In that moment, doctrine failed him because doctrine could not account for the reality of terror. His body, his reflexes, his animal need to survive did what training had not prepared him for, and it worked. This was true across the war. Innovations born of desperation often proved more effective than those designed in peacetime. Soldiers in Stalingrad fighting room to room developed tactics that contradicted every manual. Pilots over the Pacific, outnumbered and outgunned, discovered maneuvers that training had deemed impossible or too risky. Submariners, hunted in deep water, improvised evasion techniques that defied established procedure. Each time, the immediate need to survive drove experimentation that formal doctrine had not permitted. The military institutions that learned fastest from these innovations, that trusted their personnel to adapt and rewarded effective improvisation, gained decisive advantages. Those that clung to doctrine, that punished deviation or ignored frontline feedback, stagnated and suffered. The difference was cultural as much as tactical. Organizations that valued learning over conformity, that treated combat as an ongoing experiment rather than a scripted performance, evolved in real time. Those that did not. American forces, for all their flaws and failures, excelled at this. The sustained fire tactic was one of hundreds of examples. Each represented a willingness to let frontline experience shape doctrine rather than the reverse. Each reflected trust in the judgment of young men thrown into impossible situations, forced to decide in seconds whether to follow the manual or trust their instincts, and often their instincts were right. German and Japanese after-action analyses of bomber defensive tactics grew increasingly frustrated. As the war progressed, intelligence officers documented the shift to sustained fire, noting its effectiveness and the challenges it posed to interceptor tactics. Recommendations were issued: attack from angles that minimize exposure to defensive fire, use higher speeds to reduce time in the kill zone, coordinate simultaneous attacks to overwhelm gunners. But none of these countermeasures fully negated the advantage sustained fire provided. The fundamental problem was volume. No amount of tactical sophistication could overcome the simple fact that bombers now filled the sky with continuous fire. Fighters had to cross that fire to reach attack positions. Crossing it was lethal. The mathematics of probability worked against them. The longer they spent in the stream of bullets, the higher the chance of taking hits. Sustained fire extended that exposure time by eliminating the gaps that had previously allowed pilots to time their runs. Some Axis pilots adapted. They developed high-speed slashing attacks, diving through formations at maximum velocity to minimize exposure. Others employed standoff tactics, using rockets or heavy cannon to engage from beyond defensive gun range. Both approaches were partially effective but could not fully replace the close range, sustained attacks that had previously been standard. The shift forced a fundamental change in fighter tactics, reducing aggressiveness and effectiveness. Captured pilots, interrogated about their experiences, frequently mentioned the psychological toll. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over Germany in early 1945, described attacking a B-17 formation as flying into a wall of fire that never stopped. He had pressed his attack, scored hits, but taken damage that forced him to bail out. His testimony, recorded in Allied intelligence files, was one of hundreds expressing similar sentiments. The Americans had not built better guns or faster bombers. They had simply learned to use their weapons more effectively. This was, in microcosm, the story of the war. Axis forces often held technological or tactical advantages at the outset, but Allied forces learned faster, adapted more readily, and scaled innovations more efficiently. The sustained fire tactic was one small thread in that larger pattern that ultimately determined the outcome of the conflict. By war's end, sustained fire was so thoroughly integrated into aerial gunnery that its origins as an improvisation were largely forgotten. Training manuals described it as standard procedure. Veterans assumed it had always been doctrine. The young gunner's moment of panic and the thousands of moments like it disappeared into the collective memory of the war as simply how things were done, but the impact remained. Post-war studies of bomber defensive effectiveness consistently highlighted sustained fire as a critical factor in reducing losses and maintaining operational effectiveness. Gunnery schools retained the technique, teaching it to generations of Cold War gunners who would never face the mass fighter attacks of World War II, but who inherited the tactical legacy of those who had. The innovation persisted because it worked not in theory, not on paper, but in the chaotic, terrifying reality of combat. The young gunner, now an old man, lived quietly. He worked, raised a family, grew old in a world transformed by the war he had helped win. He never spoke much about his missions. When he did, he focused on the mundane, the cold, the noise, the boredom between moments of terror. He never mentioned the moment his panic changed tactics. He did not know it had. To him, it remained what it had always been, a mistake, a loss of control, a moment when fear overrode training. But history recorded it differently. The mistake that became doctrine, the panic that became innovation. The 19-year-old on his first mission who, in trying desperately to survive, accidentally taught thousands of others how to do the same. The story of sustained fire is ultimately a story about learning, about systems that adapt and those that do not, about the gap between doctrine and reality and the people who bridge it, about fear and survival and the strange alchemy that sometimes transforms terror into innovation. It is also a story about trust, the trust placed in young men barely out of school, handed guns and placed in machines and expected to defend themselves and each other against skilled, determined enemies, the trust that when doctrine failed, they would improvise, that when training proved inadequate, they would learn, that when confronted with chaos, they would find ways to survive and in surviving, to prevail. That trust was not always rewarded. Many died, many failed, many followed doctrine exactly and still fell to enemy fire. War was random and cruel, and no amount of training or innovation guaranteed survival. But enough succeeded, enough adapted, enough learned from mistakes there, own and others, that the collective effectiveness of the force increased over time. The young gunner was one of thousands who contributed to that learning. His contribution was accidental, unintentional, and unknown to him, but it mattered. In the vast machinery of industrial war, where individual actions seem insignificant against the scale of armies and nations, small innovations compound. A tactic adopted by one crew spreads to another, A technique that saves one bomber saves 10, then 100. Incremental improvements accumulate into decisive advantages, and sometimes those improvements begin with a terrified teenager squeezing triggers and holding on, not because training told him to, but because every instinct screamed that letting go meant death. Decades after the war, researchers interviewing veterans for oral history projects occasionally encountered men who remembered the shift to sustained fire. They described it matter-of-factly as something that just happened one day. Gunners were firing short bursts, the next they weren't. No orders, no announcements, just a change that rippled through squadrons, passed from crew to crew, until it became standard. One veteran, a ball-turret gunner who flew 35 missions over Germany, put it simply, we stopped trying to save ammo and started trying to survive. Turns out, surviving was easier when you didn't give them a chance to get through, so we didn't. That pragmatism, the willingness to discard doctrine when reality demanded it, was perhaps the greatest innovation of all. Not a tactic or a technique, but an attitude, a recognition that plans were provisional, that theory served practice rather than the reverse, and that the measure of effectiveness was not adherence to rules but accomplishment of mission. The young gunner, whose name has been lost to history or obscured by classification, embodied that attitude without knowing it. He had panicked. He had violated doctrine. He had made a mistake, and in making that mistake, he had shown thousands of others a better way. His legacy was not fame or recognition. It was survival, his own, and that of the crews who learned from his example. In the calculus of war, where success is measured in lives saved and missions completed, that legacy was profound, not because it was heroic or visionary, but because it was practical, because it worked, because when the moment came, he did what needed to be done, and others recognized the value and followed. The sun rose over airfields across England, Italy, and the Pacific every morning of the war. Ground crews prepped bombers, pilots briefed, gunners loaded ammunition, more ammunition now, in longer belts, feeding guns that would fire continuously rather than in bursts. The sound of sustained fire became the soundtrack of bomber raids, a constant roar of .50 calibers that filled the sky with metal and gave crews a fighting chance against the interceptors that hunted them. And somewhere in that sound, in the thunder of 10,000 guns firing without pause, was the echo of one terrified teenager's first combat, the moment when panic and survival instinct converged into something that mattered. He could not have known it. He did not need to. The innovation found its own path, spreading not through command decisions, but through the organic, practical logic of men who wanted to live and discovered a way to improve their odds. That is how wars are fought. Not in the grand strategies and sweeping narratives, but in the small, desperate moments when individuals make choices that ripple outward in ways they cannot predict or control. The young gunner made one such choice. It was not rational. It was not planned, but it was consequential, and in the end, that was enough.